The story begins not with muskets or marching armies, but with a simple piece of stamped paper. In 1765, after the long and expensive French and Indian War, Britain was drowning in debt. Parliament looked across the Atlantic and decided the colonies should help pay for the protection they had received. So they passed the Stamp Act. Every newspaper, every legal document, every playing card, even dice had to carry an official stamp purchased from the crown. To the colonists, this was not just a tax. It was an insult. It was taxation without representation. In Boston, merchants closed their shops in protest. Crowds gathered in the streets and burned effigies of the stamp distributor. In New York, the Sons of Liberty organized. In Philadelphia, men who had never met before sat down together and asked the same question: who gave Parliament the right to tax us when we have no voice in that body? 9 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in New York. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and sent it to the king. Across the ocean, British merchants felt the pain of boycotts and begged Parliament to repeal the act. In 1766, the Stamp Act was withdrawn, but the victory tasted bitter. The principle had been planted. Americans would not be taxed without their consent. Parliament did not learn the lesson. The very next year, Charles Townshend pushed through new duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. John Dickinson sat alone in his study in Pennsylvania and picked up his quill. He wrote 12 letters signed a farmer. In calm, reasoned language, he warned that if Parliament could tax 1 penny, they could tax 1,000,000. Samuel Adams in Boston went further. He drafted the Massachusetts circular letter and sent it to every colony, urging them to stand together. When the royal governor ordered the Massachusetts Assembly to rescind the letter, they voted 92 to 17 to refuse. The number 92 became a rallying cry painted on tavern signs and whispered in meeting houses. British troops arrived in Boston in 1768 to enforce the acts. Tension simmered for 2 years until a cold March night in a crowd of Bostonians taunted a small group of soldiers with snowballs and insults. Someone shouted, "Muskets cracked." 5 men lay dead in the snow. Paul Revere's engraving turned the Boston Massacre into a symbol that traveled to every colony. The dead were not forgotten. Parliament repealed all the Townshend duties except the tax on tea. In 1773, they gave the East India Company a monopoly that allowed them to sell tea cheaper than colonial smugglers. 3 ships arrived in Boston Harbor loaded with tea. On the evening of December 16, a large meeting at the Old South Meeting House heard Samuel Adams say quietly, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." That was the signal. 3 groups of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the Dartmouth, the Helena, and the Beaver. Working silently by lantern light, they broke open 342 chests and dumped the tea into the harbor. Not a single person was hurt. Not a single lock was broken. The next morning, the harbor was brown with floating tea leaves. The news raced across the colonies. In New York and Philadelphia, tea parties followed. Britain's response was swift and harsh. The intolerable acts. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts self-government was canceled. Troops could be quartered in private homes. The colonies answered by calling the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September. Delegates from 12 colonies debated, prayed, and finally agreed to boycott British goods and to form the Continental Association to enforce it. They also sent a petition to the king, but many already sensed that words alone would not be enough. War came at dawn on April 19. General Gage sent 700 British regulars to seize colonial military stores at Concord. At Lexington Green they met 70 Minutemen. A shot rang out. History still does not know who fired first. 8 Americans fell dead. The British marched on to Concord, found little powder, and began the long retreat. All along the road, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers poured out of their houses with muskets. By the time the exhausted redcoats staggered back into Boston, 273 of them were dead or wounded. The siege of Boston had begun. The Second Continental Congress met in May and named George Washington of Virginia commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. On July 3, Beneath the Great Elm in Cambridge, Washington took formal command. He inherited an army that was brave but undisciplined, short of powder, and poorly supplied. Yet that same month, the Battle of Bunker Hill showed what these men could do. Twice the British charged up Breed's Hill. Twice they were thrown back with terrible loss. On the third charge, the Americans ran out of ammunition. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," the order went. The Redcoats took the hill, but at the cost of more than 1,000 casualties. Nathanael Greene later said he wished they could sell the British another hill at the same price. In the South, the British tried again. In June 1776, Admiral Sir Peter Parker and General Clinton attacked Charleston. Colonel William Moultrie's fort on Sullivan's Island was built of palmetto logs that absorbed cannonballs like sponges. The British flagship Bristol was badly damaged. Sergeant Jasper left outside the fort under fire to reattach the fallen flag. The British withdrew in defeat, and South Carolina celebrated. The colonies had shown they could defend themselves. By the summer of 1776, the question was no longer taxes, but independence. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense had sold more than 120,000 copies in 3 months, arguing that monarchy itself was absurd. Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a declaration. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft in a rented room on the second floor of a brick house. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin made small changes. On July 2, the delegates voted for independence. On July 4, they adopted the document. John Hancock signed first. "Large enough," he joked, so the king could read it without spectacles. Copies were sent by express riders. In New York, the lead statue of King George Roman III was pulled down and melted into bullets. The war had become a revolution. Washington moved his army to New York, knowing it was the strategic key. But the British came in overwhelming force, 32,000 troops and 73 warships. On August 27, they defeated the Americans at Long Island. Washington evacuated his army across the East River under cover of a miraculous fog. In November, Fort Washington fell with nearly 3,000 prisoners. The army retreated across New Jersey, morale collapsing. Many enlistments would expire on December. Washington wrote to Congress that the situation was most critical. Then, on Christmas night, 1776, he crossed the ice-choked Delaware in sleet and snow. At Trenton, the Hessian garrison was surprised at dawn and captured. A week later at Princeton, the Americans won again. The Revolution had survived its darkest hour. In 1777, the British planned to split the colonies. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with 7,000 regulars, Hessians, and Indians. At Bennington, his German detachment was destroyed by John Stark and his New Hampshire and Vermont militia. Burgoyne reached Saratoga, but his army was surrounded. Daniel Morgan's riflemen picked off officers. Benedict Arnold, though quarreling with Gates, led a desperate charge that broke the British line. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered nearly 6,000 men. When the news reached Paris, France decided to join the fight. The alliance changed the nature of the war. The winter that followed at Valley Forge was the crucible. 12,000 men marched into camp. By spring, perhaps half remained. They built log huts, froze, starved, and died of disease. Congress seemed powerless and distant. Yet a Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived. He could not speak English, but taught by example and cursing in German. He turned farmers into soldiers. Nathanael Greene became quartermaster and slowly brought order to supplies. When the army marched out in June 1778, it was a different force. That same month, they caught Clinton's army retreating from Philadelphia at Monmouth. Charles Lee ordered a retreat. Washington galloped forward in fury, rallied the men under the blazing sun, and turned the battle into a draw. The British slipped away at night, but the Continentals had proven they could stand against regulars. The French fleet arrived under D'Estaing, but the joint attack on Newport failed when a storm scattered the ships. The alliance was strained but held. On the frontier, the war was savage. Joseph Brant, the educated Mohawk chief, led raids with British support. The Wyoming Valley and Cherry Valley massacres brought horror to settler families. In 1779, General Sullivan marched north and burned Iroquois villages, destroying food stores and leaving thousands homeless. In the west, George Rogers Clark led 170 men through flooded prairies in the dead of winter and captured Vincennes from Henry Hamilton, securing the Northwest for America. At sea, the Continental Navy was tiny, but thousands of privateers swarmed. John Paul Jones took the war to British waters. In September 1779, his bonhomme Richard fought the Serapis for hours. When the British captain asked if he had struck, Jones answered, "I have not yet begun to fight." The Serapis eventually surrendered. American privateers captured hundreds of British ships, hurting trade and forcing Britain to divert warships to convoy duty. 1780 became the year the Revolution nearly died. In May, Charleston fell, the largest American surrender of the war. In August, Horatio Gates was routed at Camden. His army disintegrated. Benedict Arnold, embittered by real and imagined slights and deep in debt, opened secret correspondence with the British. He offered to sell West Point for £20,000. Major John Andre was sent to meet him. Andre was captured with the incriminating papers. Arnold fled to the British sloop Vulture. Andre was later hanged as a spy. Washington wrote that treason of the blackest dye had been discovered. Mutiny followed. In January 1781, Pennsylvania soldiers, unpaid for years, marched on Philadelphia. Anthony Wayne tried to calm them. When that failed, they killed 2 loyalist agents sent to seduce them. The mutiny spread to New Jersey. Washington sent troops under Robert Howe. 2 ringleaders were shot. The army survived, but the warning was unmistakable. Without money and supplies, it would collapse. In the South, Nathanael Greene took command. He divided his small force, sending Daniel Morgan west. At Cowpens, Morgan used a brilliant double envelopment and destroyed Tarleton's legion. Cornwallis pursued Greene across North Carolina in a race that became known as the Race to the Dan. At Guilford Courthouse, Greene fought a costly battle, losing the field but bleeding Cornwallis so badly that the British general abandoned the Carolinas and marched to Virginia. Washington saw his chance. In August 1781, he learned that Admiral de Grasse had sailed for the Chesapeake with 3,000 troops. In a brilliant deception, he left Clinton guessing in New York and marched 450 miles south with Rochambeau's French army. De Grasse sealed the bay. Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown. For 3 weeks, the guns thundered. On October 17, a drummer beat for parley. On the 19th, the British marched out between lines of American and French soldiers and laid down their arms. Cornwallis pleaded illness and did not appear. The band played "The World Turned Upside Down." The war was effectively over. Peace negotiations dragged on in Paris. In September 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized American independence with boundaries to the Mississippi River. Washington resigned his commission in Annapolis on December 23, 1783, returning to Mount Vernon as a private citizen, the first great voluntary surrender of power in modern history. The Revolution was not won by a single battle but by endurance through 8 years of hardship, betrayal, mutiny, alliance, and miracle. 13 colonies had become the United States, imperfect, experimental, and free. The experiment in self-government had survived its birth pangs. The world watched, and history turned.